So we're going to continue our discussion with a very brief history of the Civil Rights Movement. Now this is a very brief history. There is so much that you can talk about with the Civil Rights Movement. I can't possibly hope to cover it even in 10 videos. This is just to give you a very brief overview. So employment discrimination has existed in America for a long time. Actually, quite frankly, as long as before we were a country, we were still a colony. You think about slavery, discrimination against Catholics in certain colonies, discrimination against foreigners in certain colonies, the practice of indentured servitude, where poor people had to work under basically slave conditions in order to pay for their passage to the New World. I mean, there are so many examples of employment discrimination throughout our history that, you know, it's obvious we have a lot of work to do. Now, the Declaration of Independence describes unalienable rights, or what we call natural rights. This comes from John Locke. And natural rights are those to which all human beings are entitled. Again, in the United States, we typically think of life, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? Now, following the American Revolution, and we're kind of starting to shift towards the Civil War and Reconstruction, slavery became a huge point, in fact, the point of being a crisis during the Civil War. And in 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation declaring that all former slaves were now free. And after the Civil War, Congress passed a variety of amendments designed to protect the rights of former slaves. But these laws were generally not rigorously enforced in the United States, and the southern states in particular adopted a variety of segregation statutes known as the Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws basically institutionalized all sorts of practices like segregation, separate but equal. We'll talk about that in just a second. Now, it's not just the former slaves that have faced discrimination in the United States. Native Americans, what we did to the Native American populations, more or less amounted to population and cultural genocide. When Mexico ceded Texas, the 90,000 Hispanics that were living in Texas became U.S. residents, but again, they were also subjected to a lot of discrimination. When Chinese laborers began to enter the country during the gold rush and during the railroad era, they were treated, of course, very poorly, and they also worked for substandard wages. And, of course, Japanese immigrants that came to this country also faced a huge degree of inhospitality. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed to prevent racial discrimination. And this stemmed from the fact that former slaves still faced a lot of discrimination, and it finally came to the attention of the Supreme Court. Now, what wound up happening during the findings of these cases in the Supreme Court was that the Supreme Court narrowed the understanding and the meaning of the 14th Amendment to the point that it became irrelevant to preventing social and economic bias. One great example, or an unfortunate example, a good example from an illustrative point of view, I mean, but an unfortunate example in terms of the Civil Rights Movement, was the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. If you can see me. And that occurred in part because of the Separate Car Act, which was passed in Louisiana in the 1890s. The Separate Car Act meant that people of African descent had to be seated in a separate car. So in June 7th, 1892, Homer Plessy, who is 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African descent, was asked to move to a non-white coach. And he refused to do so, and he was, of course, thrown in a New Orleans jail. He brought lawsuit saying that he was entitled to equal protection of the laws as stated in the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court disagreed, and they said that he was given a separate but equal car, and therefore he was given an equal degree of protection under the law. This more or less completed the destruction of the 14th Amendment as a way to guarantee civil rights. And the Plessy versus Ferguson case further emboldened legislators in the American South. The Jim Crow laws, which I mentioned previously, became even more and more widespread, to the point that workers of African descent faced even more blatant and open discrimination, and these customs unfortunately also spread to the north. Now, during the 1950s and 60s, there was a large civil rights movement that rose. Many of you probably have studied this in grade school and high school, so I won't go into too much detail here. But the thing that I want you to remember is the pressures of this movement led to a lot of different social reforms, including the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And one of the big things from the passage of the Civil Rights Act was Title VII, which prohibits discrimination in any aspect of employment. And Title VII also created the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, also known as the EEOC. I briefly referenced that in another video. Now we're actually going to talk about it a little bit. So, Title VII enforced a legal theory of disseparate treatment, and once it went into effect, that meant that employees could no longer engage in outwardly visible displays of discrimination. So there'd be no more signs that say like a white-only restroom. They couldn't, use racial slurs in the workplace, no derogatory pictures, nothing that created a hostile work environment. The problem with Title VII, of course, was the fact that there was no real legal weapon to actually fight the disseparate impact. So just because there was some degree of discrimination that took place didn't mean that you could actually do anything about it. Now, another case that came up was the Briggs versus Duke Power case. So in the Briggs versus Duke Power case, the Supreme Court, let me take a step back. Briggs was a worker at Duke Power, and they had a policy that you had to have a high school diploma in order to advance into certain occupations. Briggs argued that this was a discriminatory practice because a lot of African Americans at that time did not have a high school diploma. But he argued furthermore that he didn't need a high school diploma for that job. So when he brought his case, the Supreme Court agreed with him, and the Supreme Court held that diploma requirements and the tests that were the high school diploma requirement and the tests that Duke Power instituted were basically designed to screen out African Americans and other protected classes. And these tests and requirements were illegal unless employers could show that it was near and dear to the mission of that firm, BFOQ. If he actually needed a high school diploma to do that job, it would have been legal. But in this case, he did not need a high school diploma or to pass any of those specific tests, so it was not a bona fide occupational qualification. And the Briggs decision and the legal theory of disseparate impact was necessary for Title VII to work. So the theory of disseparate impact were those policies of having a high school diploma or passing those tests that were separately or disproportionately harming African Americans and other protected groups. Now, in 1978, the EEOC also defined as illegal disseparate impact for employers with a guideline known as the 80% rule. And the 80% rule basically stated that you should try to have 80% of your employees match the different protected groups based on their proportion in the population. In our next video, we're going to talk about affirmative action, and I'll see you there.